Welcome to Over There, Americans at War in World War I, Part 1, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I by declaring war on Germany. That same month, songwriter George Cohan wrote a tune that would become the most popular song in America during the war years. This famous song is called Over There. You might find it a little hokey, but the song was very inspirational to Americans whose sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands were overseas fighting the war to end all wars. It's also pretty catchy. Here are the first few verses.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boy's in line. Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
In this two-part tutorial, you'll learn about the experience of the Americans who served over there during World War I as part of the American Expeditionary Force. You'll learn how the U.S. assembled an army of millions, what battles and campaigns the soldiers participated in, and how America played a central role in winning the war for the Allies. You'll learn about the horrors of trench warfare and the new technologies that made the First World War such a long and deadly conflict. You'll learn about how Americans of different backgrounds and races experienced the war differently. And you'll learn about some of World War I's veterans who went on to become famous Americans. Let's review some basics about World War I. At the time, before there was another World War to compare it to, it was simply called the Great War. The war began in 1914 after the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Empire of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated in Sarajevo. This incident wasn't exactly the cause of the war, but it did trigger a complex system of alliances and war declarations that pitted the major powers of Europe against one another. The conflict ended a century of relative peace and the balance of power in Europe. The two sides in World War I are known as the Allies and the Central Powers. To start, the Allies consisted of the empires of Great Britain, France, and Russia. Japan soon joined the Allies, as did Italy in 1915, and many other nations followed. The Central Powers consisted of the empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as the Ottoman Empire, which includes modern-day Turkey. Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in 1915. The violence and death of the first months of the Great War stunned all who were involved. After early offensives failed, the war settled mostly into defensive trench warfare, in which neither side could gain much ground or achieve clear victories. World War I quickly became a stalemate with no end in sight. It also became a meat grinder for young lives. About 10 million soldiers would die in action by its end. The United States was originally determined to stay neutral, but America began to support the Allies with trade and loans. And when German submarine attacks killed Americans at sea, most famously when the ocean liner Lusitania was sunk in 1915, public opinion turned against the Germans. Still, the U.S. remained neutral. President Woodrow Wilson was even elected to a second term in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But in 1917, the fourth year of World War I, two important things happened. First, the Russian Empire dissolved into civil war. The Bolshevik Party, a group of communist revolutionaries, seized power. Russia's new government seemed ready to sign a peace treaty with Germany and leave the Allies. This would help the Central Powers greatly. Second, after promising not to, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied and American shipping. When more American ships were sunk, President Wilson asked for and received a declaration of war against Germany. After years of strained neutrality, the U.S. had joined the Allies. America had never before played this role in its history, forming alliances with other nations to join a global war. Even after war was declared in 1917, it was unclear how many troops the United States would commit to the fight in Europe, or even if it would send an army at all. Americans were certainly willing to give money to the Allies, provide supplies and weapons, and lend naval support. But the other allies, especially the French, insisted that the U.S. send some sort of army to boost the morale of the European soldiers that had already been in the fight for years. This was easier said than done. In 1917, the combined strength of the regular army and the National Guard was only about 379,000 men. To send a major fighting force overseas, something the U.S. had never done before in its history, millions of soldiers would be required. So, President Wilson signed into law the Selective Service Act of 1917. The law required men aged 21 to 30 to register to be drafted for military service. Later, as the need for soldiers increased, the ages of eligibility would expand to include 18 to 45-year-olds. Within months, nearly 10 million American men would register for the draft. Close to 3 million would be drafted by the war's end. Close to 30% of draftees were actually rejected for service, for failing physical and psychological tests that were part of their training. Some dodged the draft when called up or refused to register. To make them comply, the government formed an American Protective League of private detectives to go on slacker raids in search of draft dodgers. More than 50,000 would be arrested for ignoring or violating the Selective Service Act. Not all soldiers were draftees. Another 2 million would volunteer for service. But it would take time to recruit and train an army millions strong. Until then, a small force of about 14,500 soldiers, nicknamed doughboys, were sent to France under the command of General John J. Pershing. They disembarked in late June and reached Paris on the 4th of July, 1917. Grateful French citizens showered them with flowers. The small force sent to France under the command of General Pershing was the beginning of the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF. This was the name for the U.S. Army sent overseas to fight in World War I. Their commander, known as Black Jack Pershing to his men, was a solid professional. Earlier in his military career, Pershing had first distinguished himself in the Indian Wars of the 1880s and 1890s, then in the Spanish-American War and in the Philippines. President Theodore Roosevelt had taken a personal interest in Pershing's career and promoted him to general. Just prior to being given command of the AEF, Pershing had led an army expedition into Mexico in an attempt to capture the outlaw Pancho Villa. During World War I, General Pershing was given a significant amount of control over his AEF and how it was to be run. He was responsible for the organization, training, and supply of an army that eventually totaled 2 million soldiers in the field, 1.4 million of whom would see combat. It was a massive undertaking. Pershing was well respected, if not especially well liked, by the soldiers who served under him. He was a strict disciplinarian who nonetheless looked out for the safety of his men. For example, Pershing oversaw the creation of an improved waterproof combat boot designed to protect soldiers' feet against the wet and muddy conditions of trench warfare. It was nicknamed the Pershing boot. General Pershing insisted that the AEF remain a distinct fighting force under American command. This meant that he did not want to lend American troops to the other allies to fill gaps in their armies or allow Americans to be commanded by other nations' generals. Pershing would eventually wind up bending on this policy, but for the most part, he succeeded in keeping the AEF separate from the other Allied armies. In this sense, the U.S. fought alongside the Allies, rather than truly fighting as one of them. General Pershing also insisted that AEF troops be fully trained before going to Europe, not drilled on the job half-heartedly. This meant a significant delay as an army was drafted, mobilized, and trained for combat. As a result, few Americans arrived in France in 1917, and the token AEF force Pershing had brought over in June saw very little action that year. They drilled and even had sightseeing opportunities in Paris. That would soon change in 1918. The AEF saw little action in 1917, the first year of the United States' involvement in World War I. But 1918 was a different story. By May, 1 million Americans were stationed in Europe. By June, thousands of new doughboys were arriving every day. In 1918, the last year of World War I, the AEF was tested by fire. Americans who fought on the Western Front in France soon realized that trench warfare was nothing like the romantic vision of war they might have imagined before going overseas. The Great War was so dangerous because all the new technologies of the 20th century had combined to make the killing of men a science. Machine guns and artillery were so deadly that they eliminated armies' abilities to make successful frontal assaults like in previous wars. Soldiers advancing into machine gun fire were simply sliced to ribbons. Even the bravest human beings could not withstand the modern weapons of war. So, by necessity, World War I had become a largely defensive conflict, especially on the Western Front, where most Americans saw action. Soldiers on the front lines lived 24/7 in trenches their armies had dug out of the earth. Their constant companions in the trenches included foul water, mud, rats, and lice. Disease was common. Trench warfare was mostly miserable and boring, until soldiers were ordered over the top toward enemy lines by their commanders. Then it was hell. Between the trenches of each side lay a no-man's land of cratered ground, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and dead bodies. Soldiers who were ordered to cross it might be ripped apart by bullets, blown away by artillery shells, become hopelessly tangled in barbed wire, or fall into pits of muddy water where they would drown. They might make it across to enemy lines and be taken prisoner, or they might be able to return to the safety of their own trench if the attack was called off. Rarely did these assaults accomplish anything. No territory was conquered, and no ground changed hands. Many new firsts had been introduced to warfare in the last few years, all of them terrible. Airplanes and zeppelins rained death from the skies, down upon soldiers in the trenches. Armored tanks were developed to break enemy lines and ride over barbed wire and other obstacles. And most horrifically of all, poison gas was used in the first ever instance of chemical warfare. Gas attacks could burn a soldier's eyes or throat, or cause his lungs to fill with fluid, drowning him from the inside. For protection, gas masks were distributed to the troops, and the need to wear them added another miserable dimension to soldiers' lives. British, French, and other Allied troops had been experiencing this deadly stalemate for more than 3 years of war. Now, Americans were to experience it as well.